Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me this evening. This is Nick Heffley, the NYC Beekeeper. I am here back again for another Ask a Beekeeper. I'm glad to see a few folks on here. Hopefully we'll get a few more as the time goes on. So the way this is going to work tonight, as it does every month, you're going to be able to put your comments in the Facebook underneath the Facebook video. If you're watching on YouTube, you'll be able to add comments or actually get involved in the chat. Of course, as that all comes in, I will be able to see it and I will be able to respond to those accordingly. So we'll get going here in just a moment. All right. So for anybody who's on, I'd love for you to start adding some of those questions to the comments. We will get going on that in just a minute. But first, I'm going to do a little bit more of an introduction of myself. There we go. So this is me, a little bit shaggier at the time, but my name is Nick Heffley. Again, I'm a Certified Master Beekeeper. I do these type of events just to give back and to try to help out people who might need it the way people helped me out when I first got started in beekeeping. I manage about 50 hives around the city. That number goes up and down depending on the time of the season. Of course, right now it's a little bit lower than that. We're going to be installing a lot of packages next month, actually right before our next Ask a Beekeeper section. So I'll have a lot more to say about those installations at that time. But I also teach urban beekeeping. It's not that much different from regular beekeeping anywhere else. There's just a few differences or a few things we got to consider that you don't necessarily have to consider if you're doing it in your backyard or out in the country, for instance. I also do speaking engagements for different groups, If you're going to be on Long Island, I think it's 2 weeks from now, I will be at the Long Island Beekeepers Club doing a short presentation about recording data on your hives. So if you come out to that and you came to this tonight, let me know when you see me out there. All right. So with my setup here, I actually am running, I've got a couple screens that are happening. I've got a couple of different windows happening all over the place. So until I get a better setup with this, or until I get someone to actually kind of move some of these things around for me, it's just going to take me a minute here. And again, if you have any questions at the moment, please just drop them in the chat. We're going to probably work from the top down. So we'll go from there. One thing I do like to start out with before we get into the questions is to talk about a little bit about the beekeeper's calendar. That is basically what we need to be doing at the time of the year that we're in. With everything right now, we are getting ready for the season here in New York City. I know a lot of folks on Long Island, upstate a bit, out in New Jersey are doing a similar thing. We are looking to have hives that are growing right now. Ever since January, the queen has been laying her brood nest. This is the whole new generation for the season. These are the bees that are going to be taking care of the bees that are going to be collecting honey for us at the beginning of the summer. So we're hoping to find some hives that are growing right now that still have some good nutrition on them, some good honey stores, and you may even be seeing your bees coming back with a little bit of pollen right now. What you're going to want to look for in your hives is somewhat of an expanding hive. You're not going to see huge brood nests. You might not see much brood at all, but you should see some at this point. And the bees are going to be bringing in that pollen to feed those babies. That's an important thing with the hive right now, is just the buildup. So we want to do everything we can to kind of help with that. For maintenance and your equipment, you're going to want to think about making sure that all of your equipment is in good repair. If it's equipment that you had from last year that you're going to be using with your hives this year, you're going to want to get out and make sure that if you have any hives that did die over the winter, that you get them cleaned out before the temperatures get too warm and you start getting the bees start to rot or decompose inside the hive. That can ruin your comb, which is a very important resource, and that can also ruin your equipment as well. It may attract other pests, it may attract mice and other rodents, and they can do a number on woodenware. So you want to make sure to get all that cleaned up. If you are a new beekeeper or you're starting a new hive, you want to make sure to have your hive built. This is a great time to do it. For a lot of folks in our area, middle of April is when you're going to be getting your bees, and you don't want to be putting together your hives the evening before you're getting your bees. You got to put together the hives. If you're using glue in the joints, you need some time for that glue to cure. If you're going to be painting your hive, which you should, you're going to need time for that paint to dry and that paint to kind of cure and off-gas a bit before it's housing any bees. So you want to make sure that it's everything's very much set up and ready to go. I recommend to everyone to get your hive out and set up 2 weeks before your bees come. The reason for this is not just to have it out there for a long time. It's really there so that you can set it up and see if you need anything. And with that 2 week time frame, you still have time to make a last minute order for equipment, try to figure out what you're going to do to fix any problems you have before the bees get here, because on the day they get here and the day that you're installing them, you do not want to be dealing with any equipment issues. And of course, at this time of the year, we are we're very much looking at the weather. making sure that our bees are able to get out on the good days and able to have enough food stores on the cold days so that they can stay in the hive and stay healthy. This is the critical month of the year here in our area, where the bees may starve if they don't have enough food stores. So if you've gone out and if your hive is feeling a little light, figure out how to put some solid feed on it. I do have some beekeeping acquaintances who are already putting syrup on, and that's working for them. But we're kind of in that in-between period right now. So if you've got some winter patties, if you've got some fondant, those are good things to put on right now to make sure your bees will get to the spring. So with all of that, I'm going to go ahead and move this screen out of here. I hope everything's coming kind of through okay. I'm getting a little glitching here as far as my screen. So if you're seeing the same thing, you can let me know in the comments. But and actually, just for everybody who has not commented yet, please let me know where you're from. I'd be really interested to know if we're talking to beekeepers that are in the New York City area, or if you're somewhere else in the country or around the world. So please just drop a chat comment in that says your city, or if you're in the city here in New York City, maybe your neighborhood. That would be awesome. So we've had a couple questions come in. I'm going to get in here and see what we can do. Thank you for the note on the music. I will make sure that that is down. It's nice to have something there for the in-between parts of all the talking, but it is nice to not have that overshadow. All right, we've got some folks from Alabama, Delaware. I see some familiar names on here as well, so it's good to see everybody. So we're going to start off with this first question here from Mr. Chad Dombeck. He wants to know, do you need a lot of space to set up a hive? So the short answer is no. We can move on to the next question, but I'll elaborate a little bit. The thing about the hive is that it's about a 2 foot by 3 foot footprint, a little bit smaller than that actually, and that's really all you need. And in a city like New York City, or really any urban area, you will see people put hives anywhere where they can fit them. They'll be on the smallest little rooftops, on balconies, in little alleyways, in very small backyards. So you really don't need a whole lot of space for them. The biggest thing you want to make sure is that you have space to work around them. So, and you want to make sure your space is not too precarious. I've seen hives that were sitting up on top of garages that were clearly, the roofs were clearly not meant to hold a load more than like the snow load that they might get in this area. So you want to make sure that wherever you're putting the hive, it can withstand not only the weight of the hive, which may be upwards of 250 or 300 pounds at its heaviest, but also the weight of 1, maybe 2 adults, especially if you're beekeeping with a friend, or if you occasionally want to bring someone to the bees. You want to make sure that that space can hold the weight of the people and the hives that you have there. And then you want to be able to work around them. Ideally, you can walk around the hives, and you can make sure to keep things clear. When you're working in with the frames, you have a space maybe to set the frames down. When you're pulling the boxes off, you have a clear space to put the boxes where you're not going to be right on top of the entrance and crowd the bees. And yeah, it's just the more space you have around the hive, the better time that you're going to have taking care of the bees, the more enjoyable of a time. So If you can do it in a backyard and you've got plenty of space around you and you don't have to lift equipment up to a roof or move it down an alleyway, that's a great thing as well. But really, you need probably about a 4-foot by 4-foot space to safely have a hive. So that's my long answer for that question. I hope that helped. Looks like we had a few more here. All right. So this is a good question for people who are setting up their hives right now. This is happening for a lot of people, whether you've been keeping hives for a long time or you're setting up your first hive now. The question is, does the hive really benefit from facing east? And this is one of those questions that has many answers to it, and it will depend on the beekeeper that you're talking to. So the best thing I would say is that bees are very adaptable, and they will adapt to whatever direction the hive is in. The bees will overwinter in a hive that is pointed in any direction. Does it make it marginally better if they are facing east? I think they've done studies and they've found that hives that face east generally have a little bit better chance of surviving, have a little bit better chance of being a little stronger. And the idea is that the morning sun hits the hive, and that sunlight coming in the entrance helps wake up the bees and get their clock going for the day, and they go on their way and start doing the work they need to do. But if you are a pro who has a palate, and just like you mentioned here, those hives are facing typically 180 degrees from each other, there's a reason that they put those out and they don't worry about them too much, because the bees will figure it out. And the bees they'll figure out a lot of things. And we should always remember that, if they find a cavity that they like, it doesn't matter what it is, they will make a home out of it, whether it's an old tractor tire or a water meter cover or someone's wall. The bees, if they find a place that suits them, that has the right size and is not being bothered, and generally is a good environment, they'll stick with it. So and those aren't always facing east. So that's a good question. If you can face them east, if you have that luxury to do that, then great. If you don't, then I wouldn't worry about it too much. And let's see about your follow-up question here. So we have another one from High Flight. Thinking ahead, when I add a second deep, do you suggest moving any frames up to the new box, or just put a box with 10 frames or with 10 new frames? So the general direction that the bees are going to move is more or less always up. They generally will not move down. So if you get the brood nest nice and established in the bottom box and then put space above them, they will move up and they'll start to use that. But since they've gotten established down in the bottom box, they're going to be more likely to use that space more efficiently. In fact, when I am starting out new equipment, a lot of times because of the logistics of moving equipment around from yard to yard like I do, I try to keep a lot of equipment on site. And generally for hives where I have double deeps, I will just keep the hive in 2 deeps, and every time I do an inspection, if too much of the brood nest has moved into the second box and there's a lot of empty space in the bottom box, I'll actually move frames around and reorganize them all in the bottom and push that brood nest out in the bottom box instead of letting it stay up. You hear stories all the time of people whose hive just kind of chimneyed through the middle of the box. So if you can do that, if you can keep that space empty above and keep the brood down, they will draw out everything very quickly. And last year in particular, I really spent some time with a handful of hives, making sure that I was moving stuff down and kind of reallocating all of the drawn comb so that they always had new frames to build on. And they built out 2 deep boxes uh, during the nectar flow, which is for us here in the city is June. And usually, if you just let them go with their own devices, they're not gonna fill out maybe even a whole box full of comb. So you can really encourage them to build and do that. You do have to be careful about how you reorganize everything. You don't want to set them up in a way where you're putting too much of the brood nest in one area and too much of the other half of the brood nest in another area. So generally what I'll try to do is I will expand the frames in the bottom box, take out a couple on the side, expand the frames in the bottom box, and then I'll take the brood frames from the top and I'll kind of put them in between. There's times when you don't want to do this technique, and if you don't have a very a good size healthy colony, then you might not want to split things up too much. But if you have a decent sized colony and the temperatures are comfortably above 55 or 60 degrees, then you should be fine. So you can really build out a lot of comb pretty quickly if you stay on top of them and kind of help them out. Let's see. We're going to look at this next question from Gretchen. Is it true bees forage 100 yards or so from the hive, so spreading flowers near the hive wouldn't be where they would forage? This is true. This is something that you will notice if you have not already started your hives. Once you do put them in, you will see bees go to some of the flowers in your yard or in the vicinity of the hive, but generally they're going to go up and out. Here in the city, a lot of our forage comes from trees. So even on top of my house where I regularly keep a few hives, if you're walking on my block, you will never see any bees. Or if you do, you'll see like 1 or 2. It'll look very normal compared to anywhere else. And that's because they're going up and out, and their territory covers a much larger space than any one small property that their hives are at. So don't worry too much about trying to feed your hives from your property or from your yard. What I would do is consider what kind of flowers you like, what kind of flowers are pollinator-friendly flowers, and plant those if you want to plant something for forage. Just be aware that the bees that are going to be coming to those are probably from other hives, but you'll also be feeding a lot of the wildlife around as far as other bees and other types of pollinators. So it's a good thing to do either way, just you're not necessarily going to be feeding your own hive when you do that. So thanks for that question. I see a question here from John talking about some feeding. So earlier I did talk about feeding something to the bees right now, as this is the critical time in our season. If you are down south, I see we have Gretchen from Alabama. You might be well past the time where your bees may or may not make it over the winter if you've had any cold snaps at all. But here we're still getting days where we're in the 30s, and so we have to make sure that our hives have enough nutrition on the hive right now, or that we keep giving them supplemental nutrition to get them through to kind of the flush of the dandelions and some of these other early spring blooms that will be coming out very soon. For me to decide whether I'm going to use a solid feed or a syrup feed, or meaning a liquid feed, it really depends on the weather and the temperatures. When you use a liquid feed, you're introducing moisture to the colony, and moisture can evaporate and condense inside the colony. So if we're having these if we're still having this weather pattern where we're getting, days up near the 60s and then all of a sudden back down to the 30s or the 20s, and we're having these big swings, I might hold off on syrup, and I might stick with pollen patties, which is what I use. You may use just granulated sugar or fondant or sugar cakes, but any of those things are good to put on right now just as a insurance policy for your bees. Once the temperatures are, pretty steady in the 50s, that's when I generally will start feeding. I do know, like I said earlier, I have one beekeeper friend right now who's been feeding syrup for at least like a month now, maybe longer, and their hives are doing fine, no issues. But and I know other beekeepers who, March is their time. So I think generally for me, it's like the end of March, beginning of April that I start doing it. But with the temperatures changing and each year maybe being a little bit warmer than the last, it's something to think about as you're following that across, or following the temperatures, I should say. Let's see here. All right, we'll go to, we've got Eric right here. Get that question up. All right, Eric says, I have a weak hive between 5,000 and I assume 10,000 bees that has made it through the winter on Long Island. Is it too cold to see if the hive is queen right? So it depends on the week that you're talking about. This week in particular has been pretty cold here in the city, and I assume on Long Island you're at least 5 to 10 degrees cooler than we are. So this week would not have been a good week. We have had days a few weeks ago that were consistently in the 60s, and those were great days to get out and check. And there's several hives that I've been out to and I've actually pulled frames from, not just peeked in through the inner cover, but actually pulled frames and looked at the brood and tried to see if they were queen right. So the short answer is yes, it can be late enough into the winter that you can check, but you just have to do it based on the weather, based on the temperatures. Generally, I try to not open the hive unless I've got, calm, sunny weather that is, 45 or above. Really, probably needs to be about 55 and above to safely pop the lid and peek in and see how the bees are doing. The bees aren't warming the whole box, so you don't have to be so worried about just letting all the heat out because they're just warming their cluster. But of course, if it's a windy day and it's 50 degrees out and the sun's not out, then it's going to be very easy for that colony to lose a lot of the heat from the cluster and have a difficult time to not only keep themselves warm, but also keep any brood warm that they have. And with 5,000 to 10,000 bees, that's a pretty small colony. So what I would do is on the next sunny day, go out, pop the lid and see where they are in the colony. Make sure that the hive is nice and heavy, and then if they need, put something on them for food, and just let them ride out the rest of the winter, and wait for a little bit nicer day, a little bit warmer day to actually go in and actually look at brood, do a proper inspection. But if you don't mind, what are the temperatures right now in Long Island? If you can throw that in the comments. Well, in the meantime, we're going to go on to Mike here. Can I explain what I meant by the bees chimneyed? sounds like you don't want to have that happen in the hive. So this is basically when the bees aren't making full use of the space in the hive. We have to remember that in nature, generally the bees are going into a tree trunk or some other cavity that is more irregular or more round, and not necessarily the shape of a perfect rectangle like we use with our boxes. So the bees aren't necessarily naturally going to fill out into all the corners, and depending on their size, they may not even fill out to the sides of the box, especially if you have like a 10 frame box. So what will happen often is if the colony is of a certain size and they're growing, but they have a lot of space to move up, they'll just continue to move up rather than out. And they'll kind of create a chimney of their brood nest in the middle as opposed to branching out. So that's basically what I meant, just to kind of push those frames out and guide the bees down into those spaces that they haven't quite used yet. And that's very easy to do when you have new equipment, because you have empty frames always that you can pull out, and you can put in frames that they've started on, and you can really spread them out in the bottom box. The more you can do that, the better chance that they're going to use more of inside of the boxes that you're using for brood. And then once they get up to the top, hopefully that queen has really got a really good force to raise all of the brood, which is going to lend to a forager force that's going to be really good at going out and foraging and collecting a lot of honey. And the stronger the hive gets, the more honey that they're going to go and collect. And so you'll be able to stack more supers on that hive if you can be efficient with all your space. So that's definitely one way to do it. If you want to be more hands-off with beekeeping, you don't have to worry about that at all. Let the bees do what they want inside, and get what you get as far as the honey goes. It's always good to have some clear objectives about what you want to do and what your goals are for your hive and for your beekeeping for the season. And then you can determine whether you're going to work to produce honey, whether you're going to work to just produce happy bees, whether you're going to actually want to try to produce another colony or another split or something like that. So you can't do all those things at the same time. Hopefully you can have happy bees the whole time, and hopefully you can take care of them well enough that they're going to like to live there. But as far as making honey or making bees, you kind of have to pick one or the other and go with it. And of course, any beekeeper class you go to or old beekeeper you talk to, they're going to tell you the bees don't read the books. So they're going to do what they want in a lot of ways, and sometimes you just have to sit back and let them work it out. So yeah, on Long Island, you're getting about 45, 50 degrees right now. We're getting about that, maybe 5 to 10 degrees more, but it's still a big swing. If you're getting I think we're getting down into, let me look at my weather forecast here. Let's see, this week, Saturday, we're going to be getting down to low of 31, high of 52. Tomorrow's going to be a high 58, low 41. Sunday's going to be pretty chilly as far as the next few days go. Low of 31, high of 43. So high of 43, you could lift a lid if it's not too blustery, or if it's a nice sunny day, then you'll probably have some bee activity. But that's kind of the tipping point. Once it starts getting below that, especially with any wind or with any kind of coolness from the weather, then the bees are going to stay inside, and it's probably not a good time to inspect. Another question from John. Let's see what we got here. Okay, as a new backyard beekeeper and thinking way ahead now, what are your thoughts on preventing swarms? Very good question. And I'll tell you, as a new beekeeper, especially if you're going to be starting with a package this year, um, you're not going to really have to worry about swarms too much. There is always a way to cause a swarm if you're not giving the bees what they need as far as space goes. But when you start with a package, they're going to be working from basically nothing. They're going to have to build comb. They're going to have a place for the queen to lay. She's not going to be able to lay immediately. And they're going to be starting basically from zero. If you're a brand new beekeeper, then you're also going to be starting from zero, meaning all of your equipment is going to be completely new. You're not going to have any comb. You're not going to have anything for the bees to really, get a head start on. So it's going to be difficult for them to build up enough to need to throw off a swarm. They're probably just going to build up enough to actually fill the boxes that you give them. There's always recommendations for your first year hive that you're not going to get, or to not count on honey. And in my experience, that varies. Sometimes you'll have just a really great year and the package will just build up like crazy and they will create a lot of honey that you can take. Of course, you need to leave plenty of honey as well, but if you have an average year or a below average year, you're not really going to have enough resources coming into the hive to allow the hive to swarm. So that's the big thing if you're just starting off. This is different if you're starting off with either equipment that is drawn out, so comb that is drawn out. If you're starting off with a nuke, if you're starting off with anything more than a package of new equipment, then it is definitely possible for the bees to get ahead of you and decide that this hive is not the right hive anymore. It's not big enough. It doesn't have what we need. And they send off a swarm and you lose your queen and half your population, and they've got to start all over again. Now they will create a new queen and probably do just fine going into the summer. But if you're on our nectar flow schedule here in New York City, June is basically our only nectar flow. We have a little bit of one in the fall, but the main one and the one where all the beekeepers are getting most, if not all, of their honey is in June. So if you happen to get a nuke at the beginning of May, put them in a box, and then don't give them space, by the end of May, you may have allowed the right conditions for them to actually swarm on you. So that is something to consider. So all that being said, you want to make sure that they have plenty of room to going up. You want to be ahead of them when they need space. Generally in the brood nest, when they are working about 7 frames or 70% of the frames in the box, then you want to add a new box. Once you've got either your 2 deep boxes, or if you're using medium boxes like I do, you have about 3 of those, then you can start adding your honey supers. And in the honey supers, I like to try to add a new one when the current one is about 50 to 60% worked over. If they're really filling it up, if the nectar flow is on, if you are too late on adding those, then you're going to lose out on honey. And then you also risk this chance of being too small of a hive and the bees actually just deciding to swarm. So yeah, I see you're getting 2 nukes, all new frames, definitely putting the cart before the horse, just thinking ahead. It's never a bad thing to think about swarms. The good thing is it's not as pressing in your first year, but your first year overwintered, meaning your second year beekeeping, if your hives get through, then you're going to need a strategy. This bit me the first time it happened for me. I know beekeepers this past year that bit them when they had successfully got hives through the winter, and then all of a sudden the beginning of April or the middle of April hit and their hives were swarming. And those hives can just explode so quickly coming out of March and going into April that if you're not watching them, if you're not on top of them, you're going to lose all your bees, and you'll ultimately lose all of your force for honey, and you're not going to have a very good crop by the end of the summer. So these are all good things to think about. Your first year is going to be a very overwhelming year for learning things, for trying to figure out new techniques. So I wouldn't go too crazy about, dealing with swarms or figuring out swarms, but it's not a bad thing to just have in the back of your mind that you need to stay ahead of them and make sure that they have the space they need. So if you stay on top of that, you'll be fine, and then you can worry about swarms in your second year and your third year or whenever. And I'll also add to that, if you do end up having a swarm, hopefully you've made friends with at least another beekeeper or at least another new beekeeper who you know that you can reach out to and see if they can help you. Going to a swarm for the first time, not knowing how to deal with it, is very overwhelming. There's even parts of it that can be a little bit dangerous for you or for people around. So don't just watch a YouTube video and go out and say that you can do it. Your best bet is to really find somebody who's done it before, go and help them with a swarm catch, and then once you've done that, you can be ready to either catch your own swarm or go and catch some swarms for some other folks. So I'm going to come back to the comments here. All right, we've got this one from Eric. I plan on getting a nuke this year to create a third hive. If my weak hive is not queen right, would it be better to combine with the nuke or introduce a new fertilized queen? Also a mated queen is another term for it. So this depends a lot. If you don't mind, can you tell me if there, do you currently have two hives? Let me go back to your last comment here. I assume you currently have two hives. One is just the weak one that only had like 5,000 to 10,000 bees. Is that correct? Two hives, one strong, one weak. Okay, very good. So if you're getting a nuke, you will definitely then have two strong hives. And that weak hive, really, if they aren't bouncing back by the time your nuke comes, you probably just want to combine those bees with one of the hives. This is with a big asterisk because you want to make sure that you're not putting in sick bees with your new healthy bees or with your old healthy bees. So make sure that before you do that, you do an inspection and look to see if there's anything out of the ordinary. I don't know how long you've been beekeeping, but even for beekeepers who've been doing it for a decade or more, you haven't always necessarily seen every disease that's out there. And so it's important to have a phone handy to where you can go and you can take a few pictures of anything you see that looks out of the ordinary. If it's a strange color, texture, or smell, those are my three things that if any of those things are off, I want to investigate more. I want to try to take a picture. I want to try to smell it to see if it smells like anything in particular, whether it might be kind of a musty, moldy smell or something that may be foul brood or something else. You want to make sure that you're not going to be taking a problem, whatever was making the colony weak, and giving it to another colony. But with that said, if your weak colony has no queen and they're just going to whittle away to nothing, those bees can be definitely used in one of the other hives. You also might consider all of the stores on that weak hive. If they do still have honey stores, that is honey that can also be moved over to another hive. So you have to do everything with that. You got to check things. You got to make sure that you have you're not moving problems around. That's the biggest thing. If you ever have doubts, the great thing is here in New York State, we have a great state apiarist, and we have these apiary inspectors that will come out and check your hive, especially if you suspect something like foul brood or some other disease. They are very eager to find any disease that might be out there so that they can try to contain it and keep it from spreading to other hives around. So those folks do a really great job at that. And if you have pictures and you are part of a bee club, like on Long Island, I hope you're part of the Long Island Beekeepers Club. But wherever you are, if you're part of your local bee club, make friends with a beekeeper who's been doing it for longer than you, whether that's just 2 years or 5 years or 20 years. See if you can make friends with them. Be friendly enough to be able to have each other's cell phone numbers and be able to text a picture back and forth and say, hey, I saw this weird thing in the hive, and I saw all these white crystals that were inside of these cells. Can you tell me what that is? And they may say, oh, that's just some crystallized sugar syrup, but it could also be remnants of varroa mites, like the feces they leave in the cells. So this is why we have the technology, we have phones, we have all these things that are very helpful and we can use to make our beekeeping better. So do that, get a second opinion, and don't just keep bees alone by yourself. We've had some very good questions so far, so I appreciate you guys jumping on here and asking questions. I've seen a few things as I've gone through. On Facebook in particular, I'm a member of like 1,000 different Facebook groups for beekeeping. And I saw one recently, I think it was just maybe yesterday, that was talking about how to, the person had already painted their hives, but they wanted to know if they needed to do something on the inside of the hive as well. And if you go and you look at any beekeeper, most always you're going to find that the inside of the hives are left bare. And after a year or two, you can go and look at those same insides and you'll see that they've got like a polish to them. And that's because the bees are adding propolis to those. They are collecting tree resin or plant resins, and they're creating propolis from it, and then they're patching any little cracks in the hive, cracks between your boxes, and then they're going to also polish all the surfaces, all the wood surfaces inside. So all of those nice clean wooden frames that you're putting in by the end of the season are going to be nice and have like a little bit of a stain to them because of all that propolis. The important thing about propolis is that it is kind of the first defense against disease for the bees. Propolis is antifungal, antiviral, and antibacterial, meaning that the molds and other germs that might affect your bees are not going to be able to live in a very hospitable environment unless they're in the bees. So if they're just in the hive, the propolis is really going to help keep those things down. So while it can be a pain for the beekeeper to have a hive that is putting propolis on everything, it's actually a really, really good sign that your bees are performing a healthy behavior. But that propolis, you can let the bees put it on themselves. They can also, if you have propolis or if you buy some online, you can dissolve it into alcohol and create a tincture, and then paint the inside of the hive with that. The alcohol will evaporate, and you'll just be left with the propolis film that's there. And I believe actually that post was in a Beekeepers of Long Island group post, and there were several other beekeepers out from the East End, I think, that were helpful with some of those questions or some of those answers to that question. So With that said, and going back to the beginning of this, when I talked about bees will just live wherever they want to, uh, there are beekeepers out there who paint every surface. They paint the insides, they paint the outsides, they paint the edges of the boxes, and the bees live in them and they do just fine. So, um, it's kind of a marginal thing, but it's less work for you if you don't have to paint the insides. So we got another question here from Eric. And I like this one because Eric is thinking about mites, as we should all be thinking about mites. There's lots of debate over treating for them, not treating for them, trying to raise bees that groom themselves and take care of themselves. But if we as beekeepers are just, putting our heads in the sand when it comes to mites, we are really doing a disservice to the bees. So it always makes me excited when people have questions about mite testing or treating mites. So Eric is asking, when do you begin testing mites? How often do you test? And yeah, this is a very, very good question. And it's going to be different, again, for any beekeeper that you talk to. They're going to do it on a little bit different schedule or a different method. But for me, I am testing generally the first week of every month, starting in May, going all the way through October. And depending on the weather, if it's still warm and if the hive is a good size, I may even test into the first week of November. But the key to testing is, excuse me, the key to testing is to do a mite count the same way each time so that you're consistent. I prefer the alcohol wash. This does kill the sample of bees that you're using, but it's a more accurate mite drop from that sample. The other thing is that it is the bees aren't suffering. It's kind of an instant kill when they hit the alcohol. There's also what's called a sugar roll, where you're actually using powdered sugar and you're shaking the bees in powdered sugar. The idea is that the particles of the sugar kind of get in between the mite's feet and the bees, and it kind of helps brush them off. And then once you're done and you've shaken out all the mites to count them, you can just dump the bees back in the hive, which is a great idea. But that is one thing that I think is kind of a cruel thing to do to the bees, because you really have to shake them quite violently inside of your glass or plastic jar. And you may not see any bruises or any dings or anything in their exoskeleton because they're so tiny, but you can only imagine what's happening to all of their little organs inside their bodies when you're shaking them that hard and then just dumping them back in. My thought is that there's probably a lot of them that do get pretty damaged and end up dying kind of a slow death inside, even though they were alive when you put them in, So that's my soapbox as far as methods to pick. The alcohol wash is just overall better for me. You'll have to figure out what you prefer and how you feel about all that, but that's all beside the point. So I'm testing monthly, and I'm trying to start in May. That's the short answer to your question. Some people will test only 2 or 3 times during the season, and there's other people who will be treating the hives kind of prophylactically and just putting the treatments on in September, hoping they work, and going on with their beekeeping like that. You can do that, but it's not going to be effective, especially if you have a case where the treatment either doesn't work very well, or you're in an area that has other hives that aren't being maintained very well, and you might get rid of all your mites in one treatment, but 2 or 3 weeks later they've contracted all these mites from the other hives again. So if you're going to treat or if you're going to test and then treat, you need to test again right after your treatment to make sure that it was effective. And then you need to plan to test, 2 weeks later or 3 weeks later to make sure that you don't have like a resurgence after a while. There's lots of ways you can go as far as treatments are concerned. And I always like to send people to the Honeybee Health Coalition website, which should be the honeybeehealthcoalition.com. They have a lot of free resources, free tools on there to deal with your mites, to deal with um, how to manage them. I believe they have videos on there of how to use every single approved treatment that's out there, how to do your mite counts, whether it's the alcohol wash or a sugar roll or something else like that. And yeah, so good on you for thinking about mites and staying ahead of it. And again, if you can't do it every month, just try to do it a few times during the season to keep tabs on those mites. I see another question from John. Let's see. I think you'll have to be a little bit more specific about your question there, John. I'm not sure what we're talking about, over the counter or IPA. Oh, alcohol. Right. So the alcohol that I use, I think generally they'll tell you need at least the 70% isopropyl alcohol. The higher the percentage, the better mite drop that you're going to get off the sample. So I'm generally buying like a gallon or two of the 90 or 91% alcohol each year that I use when I go out and do my tests. So it's if you find rubbing alcohol at the drugstore, that works. So it doesn't have to be like a fancy industrial grade alcohol or anything like that. And it does wonders. If you can keep up with the mites, if you can check, even if you're not checking every single hive, if you can check at least a few of your hives in your yard, you'll be shocked to see that your hive will keep the mites real low all season long, and then all of a sudden in August or September you'll have a spike of having only 1 or 2 mites per 100 to having like 7 mites per 100, and you better treat or that hive is going to eventually crash. Really, once you're getting past about 5 or 6 hives, or 5 or 6 mites per 100 bees in your sample, you're gonna that's kind of your danger zone. I know at Cornell, through the Dice Lab, they recommend in the springtime having 2 mites or less per 100 bees, and in the fall time having 3 mites or less per 100 bees. 3 mites is the threshold there. So for me, if I'm seeing anything above 2 kind of throughout the year, then I'm treating. And I'm only treating when I need to. So you don't have to, if your bees are doing a good job and they don't need to be treated, you don't have to. But the caveat to that, as there always is with beekeeping, is that if you have multiple hives in one location and 2 of your hives are great and the third one is riddled with mites, you should probably treat all the hives in one yard at the same time so that you're not just pushing the mites to a different hive. So that's what happens with all the places I have bees. I have multiple hives there, and so if I have one hive that is 3 or more mites per 100, then the whole yard is getting a treatment. So anyway, well, mites were a very good place to kind of end on this tonight. So I appreciate you asking the question, and thank you all for coming out and hanging out with me for an hour. If you have any feedback, if you see anything that you like or anything about this that just you don't like, let me know. I'd love to know. You can drop a comment. You can also send me an email at nick@nycbeekeeper.com, and that's NICK, not just NIC. But you can send me an email, let me know, and we'll make changes. I'm trying to figure this out just as much as we're all trying to figure out beekeeping. So we're going to get there. But thank you all again, and I will see you next month on the third Thursday of the month. Take care. Bye.